Hello, friends. Welcome back to the Test Those Breasts podcast. I am your host, Jamie Vaughn. I'm a retired teacher of 20 years and a breast cancer thriver turned staunch, unapologetic, loud supporter and advocate for others, bringing education and awareness through a myriad of medical experts, therapists, caregivers, and other survivors. A breast cancer diagnosis is incredibly overwhelming with the mounds of information out there, especially on Dr. Google. I get it. I'm not a doctor, and I know how important it is to uncover accurate information, which is my ongoing mission through my nonprofit. The podcast includes personal stories and opinions from breast cancer survivors and professional physicians, providing the most up-to-date information at the time of recording. Evidence, research, and practices are always changing, so please check the date of the recording and always refer to your medical professionals for the most up-to-date information. I hope you find this podcast a source of inspiration and support from my guests. Their contact information is in the show notes, so please feel free to reach out to them. We have an enormous breast cancer community ready to support you in so many ways. Now let's listen to the next episode of Test Those Breasts. Well, hello, friends. Welcome back to this episode of Test Those Breasts. I am your host, Jamie Vaughn, and today I am so thrilled to have my guest, Claire Rumore, on my show. So Claire is an erotic educator, intimacy coach, and cancer survivor, specializing in intimacy, sexuality, and body confidence during and after cancer. She is the founder of Cancer and Intimacy, an education platform dedicated to addressing the emotional, relational, and embodied dimensions of cancer recovery that medicine often overlooks. Claire bridges lived experience with trauma-informed, evidence-based education to help individuals, couples, and healthcare professionals navigate the many dimensions of intimacy with compassion, clarity, and confidence. Holy cow. Welcome to the show, Claire. How are you?
I'm great, Jamie. So good to be here.
Well, I am excited that you're here because, first of all, we were connected through someone that you recently just met, Dr. Tiffany Trosto Sandoval. And I have actually been in connection with Tiffany for about, maybe a couple of years now. And I've interviewed her on my podcast. And she is a very well-respected oncologist who has this coaching business now where she helps people through cancer. And somehow she found you and then she connected us. So how lucky are we?
Yes.
Today we're going to talk about a topic that I absolutely love just because I'm the type of person that's extraordinarily open, and especially talking about these kinds of uncomfortable topics, at least for some people, it's uncomfortable. But first I want to talk about who you are. You had a cancer diagnosis. Can you tell us, first of all, who you were before cancer? Because we know that people change. And obviously, we sometimes go into work that we never thought we would be going into, or at least in a space that we wouldn't think so. But who were you? Who was Claire?
Yeah, so I was an intimacy educator, intimacy coach, erotic educator, and just deeply immersed in the realms of sexuality, gender, and identity. That actually was my degree in college. I'm originally from Alabama. I moved to California about 20 years ago. So I've been exploring Tantra. I've been exploring all manner of sexual positivity, body positivity, personally and professionally, and really, really interested in the intersections of sexuality and spirituality. So before cancer, I was someone who was in that realm, in those fields, deeply enjoying what I was doing, but also like something's a little off, like I'm not hitting the mark. Like I'm in my field, I'm in my zone, but something's off the mark. And I was getting ready to launch a new coaching practice focused on a framework called the Erotic Blueprints. I'm not responsible for its creation. It was wonderfully created by a woman named Jaya. I give her full credit, but I'm one of their certified erotic blueprint coaches. So I was getting ready to launch this practice, have more of a presence on Instagram, just kind of be in this shiny, snazzy, new expression of my work, or so I thought. But I'm not really one to be shiny, snazzy in the influencer sort of way. It's not really my personality, but that's what I was aiming for. So let's say I was from the outside, people would say, "Oh, she's rocking it. She's living her best life. She's traveling. She's having fun. She's in this very fun and neat line of work. She's in a great part of the country." Just all these things really lining up for me. However, on the inside, again, something felt off. And let's say I was just 1 degree or 1/2 degree off center. But as we know, that over time exponentially takes you way off target. And so I didn't know that that's where I was, but life knew. And so life put the brakes on everything. So right as I was about to launch is when the cancer diagnosis happened. And
Okay, so we're going to talk about that. We're going to circle back around to what you just said about
yeah,
something was a little bit off. We're going to talk about that after the cancer
yeah.
diagnosis. Can you kind of share all the things about what your diagnosis was, how you found it, treatments, all of those things?
Right. So, how that started, the diagnosis, though I was not given the diagnosis at the time because it was such a bizarre, um, bizarre combination of tumors, tumor locations, my age, my gender, these types of things. So, they actually didn't ever diagnose officially or stage me at the start. However, my medical record now says that I actually had pancreatic cancer, and so it had spread to my colon and that it was actually at a stage 4 level. But thankfully, I did not know this at the time. So we got into treatment right away. And the way that it was caught, the way I knew I was ill, was that my vitality, my stamina, my energy kept dropping off. And there had been one morning about 3 months before the diagnosis where I was lifting a heavy water bottle, one of those 5-gallon water bottles that you put on a water crock. And I'd done it hundreds of times, but I did it a little off and tweaked my back. And so I thought, no problem, massage, chiropractic, heating, cooling, it'll work itself out. But it didn't. And the pain kept going on for weeks and weeks and weeks. And then my energy levels started dropping. My appetite started dropping. There was this pain in my back that just wouldn't go away. And then a few weeks later, a lump in my inguinal crease, right at my hip, inner crease showed up. So I thought I had a hernia or something from the lifting and didn't quite know what to do. So I'd gone to my general practitioner. She said, well, we'll need to get an ultrasound. I can't really tell until we see some inside imaging. But the appointment wasn't available for 2 more months. So a friend suggested, as I just didn't feel better for weeks ongoing. Oh, and I was not able to sleep. That was another thing, like 2 months of not being able to sleep. So all these symptoms were lining up. It was miserable. So a friend suggested, why don't you just go to the emergency room and get checked out there, which I had never considered. So we did that. So they did CAT scan, blood work, all these things at that visit, and then came back to me while I was in the waiting area and said, we see that you have, what was it? It was inflammation in your colon, pancreatitis, a mass in your colon, a mass on your pancreas. Basically, I'm not in good shape. And they said, we want to keep you here and do some biopsies. So I was in the hospital for 4 days. They did biopsies. And then that's when they landed on that the tumors were actually malignant. And then I started treatment about 3 weeks later. So the good thing about going to the emergency room was that things were caught. I don't know if early or fast. I don't know. Stage 4 is pretty far along, but I was put in the system right away and things were expedited. And I was matched with an oncologist immediately and then put into treatment as soon as possible.
Okay, so wow, because when we were doing our pre-interview, we were talking about how when people get diagnosis of pancreatic cancer, that's especially at stage 4, that's usually a death sentence. And I mean, I think I shared with you that my great aunt died. She was gone within 6 months. That was quite a few years ago. And I know that treatments are a lot more advanced now, which is nice. So I'm so glad you're here.
Me too.
So I want to talk about what you're doing in your survivorship. And, you know, breast cancer survivors, I know for myself and for others, and I know this applies to all kinds of people with different kinds of cancers, but what I know is that breast cancer survivors really struggle with intimacy, any kind of sexual pleasure. A lot of us are going through menopause, so or have
Mhm.
gone through menopause, or it's thrown us into a menopause.
Sure.
And so for my story, before we get into what you're doing, I think it was maybe about a month before I was diagnosed.
Mhm.
And I was 54 at the time. And my husband and I have always had a really great sex life. I mean, from day one, well, maybe
Mm.
not the first date, but
Early on,
from the
yes.
day we started having sex, we've always
Yes.
had a really good sex life, and we've just loved that. We were just really into each other, and even up to, that year. And
Mhm.
I remember one morning we were going to have sex, and it just knocked the wind out of me. It hurt so bad. It was I mean, it really, really shocked me. And so my husband was like, "Oh my God, I don't want to hurt you," and all this stuff.
Mhm.
And I think we kind of let it go for a little bit. And then I got the breast cancer diagnosis, went through
Yeah.
all those things. After I was better, I went to my gynecologist, and that's where she talked about how, vaginas shrink.
Mhm.
Shrink this way, they shrink this
Mhm.
way. And I'm like, what the heck? How do I change that? And she ended up putting me on Uvafem and the Reverie hydrolonic acid, and that all
Mhm.
fixed the problem.
Mm.
But there's more to the story, because that's one thing, you know, you are okay in that realm, but then there comes other things with intimacy
Mhm.
and pleasure. So I want to ask you what you're doing in your survivorship, that kind of goes along with that, like just some of the common misconceptions about sex and intimacy. Tell us how you got started in helping people with cancer.
Oh, wow. Yeah, this is huge. So let me come at it from as many angles as I
Okay,
can.
there's so
Yeah,
much.
there's so much. There's so much, and it's great stuff. So when I was going through my journey, and my journey was actually very short given the diagnosis that I ultimately had. Mine's a bit of a medical miracle story, and it's kind of a larger, maybe a whole other episode. But what ended up happening was from diagnosis to when I moved into survivorship was actually 3 months,
Oh,
roughly. And so it
wow.
was a very, very fast journey. And I couldn't tell you what I 100% attributed that to. There are so many factors that were part of that. And the treatments I did were the more traditional colon cancer and pancreatic cancer treatments. So I was on chemo, but only for 5 sessions
Okay.
instead of like a complete round. And I was also pairing my traditional treatments with more holistic treatments. And I'm not talking so much nutrition because the situation I was in, I actually couldn't eat my otherwise healthy diet that I
Right.
was so accustomed to eating. It was too healthy for me given the GI issues. So I was eating white bread, white flour pasta, with mashed potatoes, all these things that I stayed away from, but it was what I could eat.
Mhm.
And so during that illness time, it was a very different lifestyle for me than what I was accustomed to, and I kept losing weight. So, to give you more context, at the start of my journey, I decided to end the relationship I was in right at the diagnosis because it was a long distance relationship. And I could just feel in my heart of hearts that with this partner, I was going to be the one doing the heavy lifting emotionally. And I did not have energy for that. Literally could not do it. It would kill me. And so we ended the relationship and separated. And then I was surrounded by the community I have in the Bay Area. Being here 20 years, I have a number of close friends who are all also in some sort of sexuality line of work, very sex positive, very comfortable with closeness, with deep conversations, with cuddling, with massage. And so I was getting my basic touch needs met. Because when you're going through any sort of illness, the body is just wrecked. And really, it was the calming, soothing touch helped my nervous system calm, especially after treatments when, all manner of chemicals were in my body and causing symptoms or side effects. The touch and the cuddling and the conversations were really, really soothing
Mhm.
to me, mind, body, spirit. So I was in a relationship with lots of beings, during that time, and then had lots of downtime because before I got diagnosed, I thought I was just stressed and burnt out. But it turned out it was much more than that. And so finally, my nervous system got a chance to not have all the outside stimulation of needing to work and needing to live life and pay bills in the usual way. I was just really taken care of by family and friends. So that was a big help. But in terms of how my intimacy was affected, and then I'll get into how I started working with cancer, in cancer, and with cancer patients and survivors. I began losing weight. I dropped down to about 74 pounds.
Wow.
I'm around 120 now, so I've gained everything back and then some. But I dropped to so small, my hormones shut off, my period went away, my sex drive went away. And in some ways, that's the body's wisdom because sexuality and eros, as life giving and life generating as it is, it's a big use of energy, as is walking around the block, as is having a lengthy conversation. So my body knew to just be conservative with energy at the time. And so sex drive went away when my hormones shut down for that period of time. But it was actually a nice respite for me. So it didn't occur to me to bring this up to my doctor or bring this up to anyone else on my care team. So that was not how I got into this work. How I got into this work was that my social worker knew about my professional background as an intimacy coach, as an erotic educator, and sort of pulled me aside one day and shared with me from her experience that she's noticed there's a huge gap in care, huge gap in service between what patients and survivors truly need and what clinicians and care team staff are trained to provide. Even if their heart's in such a good place, they may have their own traumatic background around sexuality. They may have their own insecurities around body image or relationships and just not know how to respond to the need of a patient or not know how to say the right thing, or if they're out of their lane, out of their scope by offering support. So she pointed that out to me. I don't know if I would have noticed it otherwise because I was so focused on healing and so many other things, nutrition and movement and getting enough rest and getting to treatment on, to the clinic visits. It's a full-time job, healing. And so she pointed it out to me. I flagged it, said, let me get better and I will circle back to this. So that's when, once I was deep in survivorship, I circled back and began looking at that problem, because it is a problem, looking at this gap of care through the eyes of a sexologist, a sex researcher, and spent all of 2025 developing the first resource that is part of my work, which is cancerandintimacy.com, which is a number of resources around sexuality, intimacy specifically, and we'll define what that means in a moment, but body image, relationship and communication skills, and also how do you talk to your doctor. So the website is full of free and affordable guides, articles, blog posts, ebooks, e-courses, all manner of things to start the conversation.
So this is really great because, as a breast cancer survivor, I've gone through the whole double mastectomy reconstruction, had the deep flap, had the scar. My breasts were my favorite part of my body, all the things. And that was everything to do with intimacy for me. It was a big deal. But also, I have friends, one friend in particular who had colorectal cancer, and she ultimately had to have a permanent bag. And so, your services, your knowledge is perfect for people like her because that's another issue, I mean, having to have a bag to wrap your mind around having to spend the rest of your life with a bag is, for me, my breasts, yeah, they're different. I've got scars and all that, but you're like sewn back together and you're essentially have a fairly normal life. Obviously, not everything is normal because what's normal now, but having a
Mhm.
bag is something you have to live with every single day of your
Mhm.
life. And so I love the fact that you have those resources for people
Mhm.
like my friend. So, what are some of the common misconceptions about sex and intimacy during and after cancer? And I
Yeah.
and I also want to preface this too. I want to circle back around how to the time when you broke it off with your
Mhm.
boyfriend, right? Not everyone has the forethought to do something like that. Usually, a lot of times anyway, you get the cancer diagnosis and you're like, "Oh gosh, I have this person. They are going to stay with me and everything's going to be great." Which we know that 40%, the statistics out there, at least the last statistics I've heard is 40% of relationships end up in divorce or
Yeah.
whatever at a cancer diagnosis. You had the forethought to say, this isn't the guy for me. I I'm gonna go through this whole thing and he's not gonna be that person.
Mhm.
That I mean, and if you don't have I think if you don't have a good, foundation in a relationship as it is, that's gonna really have a lot of stress. I mean, my husband and I had a good foundation.
Yeah.
We've gone through all kinds of stuff together, therapy, all the things. And, we've gone rounds, like, we're very fiery. We're also very attracted to each other, but
Mhm.
we had a good foundation,
Mhm.
and we even struggled.
Oh, yeah.
And so it makes sense that if people don't have a good foundation, that's gonna be hard. You also had this person living in another
Right,
place,
another
right?
state. Yeah,
Right,
exactly.
right.
Mhm.
So, okay, so let's come back to this sex and intimacy. There are misconceptions when it comes to sex and intimacy during and after cancer.
Mhm.
Help us weed through all of that.
Totally, and one thing I do wanna say about the partner piece is that's why it felt so important to me to include partners in the resources and in the conversation about
Yes.
cancer and intimacy, because being a caregiver and being a lover can feel mismatched and irreconcilable. And they don't have to be, but wow, what a tender space to navigate. So, this is all part of the larger conversation, especially around sex, intimacy, cancer, and myths around these. I will say, as a sexologist, as an intimacy educator, I feel that there are myths around sexuality and intimacy in the larger cultural context in general without illness being a part of that. We're just all really poorly resourced and poorly educated about sexuality and intimacy, largely due to the conditioning we all receive as young people. And my conditioning was heavily influenced by being raised Catholic and being raised in the southern part of the United States. So we all have our different influences, for better or for worse. And we all have our own stuff to work through: sexuality, intimacy, body image, regardless of if we ever have an illness in our life or we're ever caretaking someone who's going through an illness and partnered with them. So, some of the myths that come to me right away are that intimacy and sex need to be put off the table because A, you should just be happy to be alive, and that intimacy and sex are luxuries, and that aren't you happy enough with the fact that you're still here? So that's a myth. The other myth, and this one's more applicable to the cultural zeitgeist, is that the myth is that sex and intimacy mean penetrative intercourse,
Mhm.
body parts entering into other body parts, and that's what sex and intimacy are. And that if those aren't available for whatever reason, then I am no longer a sexual person. Intimacy no longer has a place in my life. As a partner, I have to no longer have a sex life because my partner's not available for some kind of penetrative
Mhm.
activity. So let's just lay that aside. Penetrative activities of sexuality are such a tiny little part of the vast spectrum of a lifetime of limitless pleasure and possibility in the context of our eros, of our intimacy, our ability to be close. Intimacy, into me I see, is really about how safe do I feel with my partner? How vulnerable do I allow myself to feel? How can I weave pleasure in that's not just reliant on erogenous zones? So, big piece of my work is helping people redefine what intimacy and sexuality mean to them.
I love that. I have lots of ways I know.
Right.
I'm very educated when it comes to this stuff.
Fantastic.
But I
Yes.
can't wait to share it with others because I think that people really do have that misconception about that.
Mhm.
And then also, like when we get older, just things happen and libidos and, things happen.
Things change.
And then it's like, oh, well, she doesn't have sex with me or he doesn't have sex with me
Mm.
anymore. That means that, they don't love me or whatever. And that's just like literally not necessarily true.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's true, but I mean,
Large
but
time, part of the time, it's not true.
all right, friends, we're going to pause right here because this conversation with Claire was just too important to rush. In the next episode, we're going to dive deeper into what intimacy actually looks like after cancer, including body changes, menopause, libido shifts, and how couples can reconnect in ways many people never even think about. Claire also shares powerful insights about pleasure, communication, and how survivors can reclaim intimacy in their own way. So make sure you come back to part 2 of this conversation with Claire Rumore. You won't want to miss it. Friends, thank you so much for listening to this episode of Test Those Breasts. I hope you got some great, much needed information that will help you with your journey. As always, I am open to guests to add value to my show, and I'm also open to being a guest on other podcasts where I can add value. So please reach out if you'd like to collaborate. My contact information is in the show notes. And as a reminder, rating, reviewing, and sharing this podcast will truly help build a bigger audience all over the world. I thank you for your efforts. I look forward to sharing my next episode of Test Those Breasts.